Good morning. My name is Dr. Jawanza Kunjifu, and our video is from my latest book, and the book is titled State of Emergency. We must save African American males. State of emergency. We must save African American males. There's a lot that we have to cover in the brief time that we have with you. Let me just give you some of the stats, the trends that we discovered in writing this book and why we're calling it a state of emergency. If one of every three white males were involved in the penal institution, I believe white America would rise up and call it a state of emergency. Why have we not done the same thing? Because in Black America, one of every three African American males are involved in the penal institution, and we have yet to call it a state of emergency. You see, at some point you would say if the problem, if it's just a few of us, then you would say the problem is personal, it's individualistic. But when it becomes one of every three, so it used to be one of every six, then it became one of every five, then one of every four, and now it's one of every three. At what point are we going to realize the problem may not be with Willie and Daryl, it may be systemic, and we have to look at this. Let me give you some other stats that, again, reinforce the state of emergency that we're in. If 80% of the special ed children in America that were white just happened to be white males, I believe white families would again rise up and call this a state of emergency. But in Black America, 80% of the special ed children that are African American, for some strange reason, just happen to be African American male. When are we going to rise up and call that a state of emergency? If there were 3 white females for every 1 white male on college campuses, I believe white women would rise up and call it a state of emergency. So why have we not called it a state of emergency? Because in Black America, there are now 3 black females for every 1 black male on college campuses. And we won't even begin to talk about those who graduate. We need to call this a state of emergency. If white women had the life expectancy of African American males, which is only 65 years of age, I believe white women would call that a state of emergency. You see, white women lived to 79 years of age. How frightening. White women, 79 years of age. Black males, 65 years of age. Black men die 14 years before white women. When are we going to call that a state of emergency? If one of every 12 white males in Washington, D.C. were a victim of homicide, white America would call that a state of emergency. Can you imagine that? If you live in Washington and you're an African American male, it's almost like gym class. One of every 12 African American males in Washington, D.C. is going to be a victim of a homicide. Again, we need to call this a state of emergency. If 31% of white males in Alabama and Florida were permanently disenfranchised, or don't get me started with the George Bush, who was selected, not elected, to be president of this country. Literally, there are 1.4 million males who were disenfranchised, who were unable to vote. If they had been able to vote, they could have made the difference. Again, America advocates being a democracy, while we have 2 million males who are incarcerated, and 1.4 of them just happen to be African American males. But remember, in Alabama and in Florida, they are permanently disenfranchised. If 14% of white males nationwide were temporarily disenfranchised, can you imagine if 14% of the white vote was temporarily disenfranchised? White America would call that a state of emergency. So when is Black America? Because it is true, in Black America, 14% of African American males are temporarily disenfranchised. If AIDS was the number 1 killer in white America would rise up and call it a state of emergency. Later on, we'll discuss AIDS in more detail, but in white America, AIDS is not the number 1 killer. But for African American males, it has now exceeded homicide. It is now the number 1 killer of African American males. If whites were 13% of the population, but they were 35% of those arrested for drugs, and 55% of those convicted, and 74% of those sent off to jail, white America would call that a state of emergency. Reverse it. We are 13% of the population. We are 35% of those arrested for drugs. We are 55% of those convicted, and 74% of those sent off to prison. Believe me, white America would not accept that. How can you be 13% of the population but end up being 74% of those incarcerated? If white males were only 17% of the drivers in Maryland, but were pulled over 70% of the time for racial profiling, driving while white, reverse that, driving while black. You get my drift, don't you? Can you imagine? You're 17% of the state of Maryland, but you're 70% of those pulled over by the police. We call that a state of emergency. If prosecutors sought the death penalty 70% of the time when a white person killed an African American, but only 19% of the time when it was reversed, believe me, we need to call that a state of emergency. If 40% of white males in America were illiterate, white America would call it a state of emergency. In black America, hear me, 40% of African American males are illiterate. When are we going to call it a state of emergency? And then as we begin to wind down on these stats, and we'll get to the causes and the solutions for this, if whites were 13% of the population, but they were 50% of those waiting on death row, white America would call it a state of emergency. 13 does not equal 50. I repeat, if white America was 13% of the population, but 50% of those on death row, including Mumia Jamal, white America would call that a state of emergency. And we have to look at that. If whites were 13% of the population, but 67% of those juveniles in adult courts, and 77% of the juveniles in adult prisons, white America will call it a state of emergency. Later on, we will talk about that. Children do not need to be with adults. In America, black America is 13% of the population, but we are 67% of those in juvenile court, and we are 77% of the juveniles that are in adult prisons, and we have to look at that. If only 1 of every 13 white babies were born out of wedlock in 1965, but 7 out of 10 in 2001. Hear me. What happened to our family? In 1965, 1 of every 13 black babies were born out of wedlock. But in 2001, 7 out of 10 of our babies are born out of wedlock. Later on, we're going to talk about this disease of fatherlessness. The fact that many of our children, 70% of our children, do not have their fathers in the home. We must look at that. And then, last but not least, if 2 of every 3 white males were projected to be involved in the penal population in 2020, white America would call that a state of emergency. You missed that. I want you to see that stat on the board. They're projecting that in 2020, in the year 2020, it will no longer be 1 of every 3, but 2 of every 3 black males will be involved in a penal institution. Hear me. In 2020, they are projecting 2 of every 3 African American males will be involved in a penal institution. I pray we never reach a point where people will say, remember black males? Remember years ago we used to have black males walking the streets? And they're all gone. When are we going to catch and address this issue? I've tried very hard in the book, State of Emergency. We must save African American males to look at this issue. There are 4 ways. There are 4 ways that white America has to destroy African American males. In one of the books that hopefully you have is called The Countering the Conspiracy to Destroy Black Boys. We looked at the first way, and that's educationally. One of the most effective ways to destroy African American males is to destroy them in the school system. I encourage you to watch the video and read the book, Countering the Conspiracy to Destroy Black Boys. For those who have not read the book or seen the video, in the first area that America is using to destroy our males is in the area of education. And we mentioned 3 critical grades: kindergarten, 4th grade, and 9th grade. Can you imagine? Our boys are failing kindergarten. It's easy to see the problem when they're in 9th grade, 16 years of age, about ready to drop out. It's more difficult to see the problem in 4th grade. In the book, we talk about the 4th grade syndrome. The 3 critical grades: kindergarten, 4th grade, 9th grade. Why do I say 9th grade? Many of our boys, the majority of our boys, they're not dropping out on their 16th birthday. They're not dropping out in 11th or 12th grade. They're dropping out in 9th grade. We also talk in the book and wrote in the book on state of emergency, we must save African American males, and in Countering the Conspiracy to Destroy Black Boys, the 2 critical subjects. And the critical subjects are reading and algebra. Can you imagine 91% of our boys that enter prison are illiterate? We mentioned earlier on our state of emergency statistics that 40% of our males in total are illiterate. And so we have to look at this. We talk about algebra in the book as well, in both books, Conspiracy and in State of Emergency, that algebra is the critical thinking subject. But we also talk about special education. Question: is there a relationship between special education and prison? Is there a relationship between Ritalin and cocaine? And by the way, why would you give someone who's hyperactive Ritalin? And is there a relationship between special ed and prison, a relationship between Ritalin and cocaine? These issues are discussed in detail in the State of Emergency book, as well as the book Countering the Conspiracy to Destroy Black Boys. But what I want to do in this book and in this video is primarily look at the older males. This primarily looks at our boys kindergarten through 12th grade. What I want to do with the limited time that we have with you is to look at the other factors that are contributing to the state of emergency, primarily of men and not necessarily the boys. The other ways that America destroys our boys and our men is physically. And there are numerous areas where this takes place. We live in a country where we have 291 million people. We live in a country where we almost have the same number of guns. America was founded on violence. Malcolm got in trouble when John F. Kennedy was assassinated when he talked about the chickens coming home to roost, that you reap what you sow. It was founded on violence, founded on slavery, founded on taking the land from the Indians. And so now the problem is no longer just in the inner city. There will be more Columbines. There will be more Santees in America because the country is reaping what it's sowing, a country founded on violence. For example, last year, 19,601 Americans were killed, and they were primarily killed by males and primarily the use of guns. Do you know how many Japanese were killed by other Japanese in Japan? What about a number like 32? What is wrong with us? 19,601 in America, 32 in Japan. What makes America so different from Japan? What can we learn from Japan? We discuss this and much, much more in the book, State of Emergency. But what I want to look at here, besides the fact that homicide is a major problem in our community, homicide is no longer the number one problem or the number one killer of Black America, especially African American males. The number one killer for African American males, especially 18 to 34 years of age, is AIDS. I hesitate as I think about Eazy-E. We're talking about AIDS. Now, white America, in the gay community, they understood this. And AIDS has gone down in white America, but it's increasing in Black America. And we still don't get it. And for my sisters listening to this, I think you know you're not off the hook because it's the number two killer after